Especially right
Mm.
now, Ravi,
Mm.
with the importance of AI, there's a lot of acquihires going on. And
Mhm.
so sometimes you may hear of it referred to as talent acquisitions,
Mhm.
acquihires. What this refers to is when, so traditional acquisitions have products usually that are also coming with the acquisition. In acquihires, the parent that's acquiring does not keep the actual product or service that they are getting. They're keeping the people, or they're trying to keep the people. And so what we look at for acquihires that's really important is what do we do with these people once we actually
Mhm.
acquire? So do we preserve them together in a unit, or do we disperse them in our new organization?
Greetings and welcome to International Business Today, our podcast series where we talk about international business subjects of importance and current relevance, of use to academics and international business managers and students and the public that are generally interested in international business. My guest today is Professor Samina Karim, who's professor and chair of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation academic group at Northeastern University. She has an undergraduate engineering degree from Cornell, master's degrees from Harvard and the University of Michigan, as well as a PhD from the University of Michigan. She's widely published with articles on innovation and strategy appearing in the top journals in our field, such as Strategic Management Journal and the Academy of Management Journal. She has led the Strategic Management Division of the Academy of Management, which is the largest global organization of strategy scholars and some practitioners. And she now serves as president of the Consortium on Competitiveness and Cooperation. Professor Karim has served in numerous editorial positions, including associate editor of the Strategic Management Journal, and her current role is the deputy editor of Organizational Science. Professor Karim's work is focused on how firms can proactively design their organizations to be more innovative. And her research has provided key insights on how reconfiguration of a firm's activities and resources, which includes people, through acquisitions, divestitures, and knowledge recombination and redeployment, can create value for that firm. She has also highlighted the design of interdependencies, both within the firm and externally with partners, such as alliance partners, and how these interdependencies can help reduce or mitigate resource bottlenecks and task bottlenecks. Not surprisingly, she's considered one of the world's leading experts in corporate strategy and organizational design, in acquisitions and alliances, and innovation broadly defined. Samina, I'm delighted to have you on our International Business Today podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Ravi.
Um, I think if I want to start by talking about your initial work when you were a PhD student and one of your published articles, which became recognized more than 20 years later as one of the top articles published in strategy. This was on acquisitions. And you used this concept of acquisitions to link to innovation and to organizational design. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Ravi. So before I became an academic, I
Mm-hmm.
worked as an engineer for Hewlett Packard.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was there, I noticed that we were very acquisition active,
Mm-hmm.
but some of the acquisitions were kept autonomous and some of them were integrated in with other parts of the organization. And I always wondered, first, why was this decision made and how to integrate some of the things and to keep some autonomous? And then the second really pressing question is, which created more value and under what circumstances? So my dissertation really studied, and this paper that you're alluding to, looking at how firms use acquisitions to be more innovative. And
Mm-hmm.
so we wanted to study, are the firms that are acquisition active the ones that first change more in general, meaning aside from what they retain, do they add and delete more at the organization because they're acquisition active?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question we looked at is, are the firms that are acquisition active the ones that innovate more?
Mm-hmm.
And what we found is surely that the firms that are acquisition active seem to be more proactively looking at their entire portfolio, and they're going through more change. And when we look at innovations that are new to the industry, we found that those who are acquisition active are the ones creating these new innovations. So there seems to be something that's coming from using this mechanism of acquisitions that bring key resources to firms to let them be more innovative.
Mhm. Now, you've also talked about reconfiguration, that is, taking existing resources. And this has implications for what the firm does, which can involve, as you note, not only the actual act of innovation, but also expansion or contraction, divestment of the firm of its existing activities. And this alters the firm's boundaries, what the firm does versus what it doesn't do. And it also affects people in the organization, because then they'll be asked to do different things and perhaps asked not to do certain things, as well as where these people are located as they carry out their tasks. So what does all this idea of recombination imply for how you restructure the organization?
So when we did this initial study, what we found that was interesting is that acquisitions are the perfect way to study organization design.
Mm-hmm.
And this leads to this idea of reconfiguration, because organizations are forced to figure out what to do with what they just bought. So are you going to integrate it or are you not? That's the first question. But as you're doing that, you may also realize, well, there are parts of this acquisition itself that I don't want to keep, that I want to divest. And so this led me to be curious about not just acquisitions, but divestitures as well, not only of what you acquire, but divestitures in other parts of the firm as well. And then what we noticed is firms not only keep acquisitions as autonomous units, they also might actually recombine them or merge them with other existing parts of the firm. And so that's what we think of as recombination of physical business units. But when you do that, you're also moving people. So you know that knowledge is also being recombined. And then we also have areas where we redeploy resources. And again, one of those resources are people. So this initial study led to my interest in org design in general, and this idea of reconfiguration, which means that firms are proactively thinking of what to add, what to delete, what to recombine, and what to redeploy. And so one of the first studies we did looking at recombination specifically was looking at business units that were merged together within firms, and to look at whether that led to more innovation or not. And we could look at patenting by the organizations. And what was interesting is we found that what's important is that you actually recombine things that are somewhat related, again, because you need the knowledge recombination to happen, and it can't happen if things are so disparate. And the second part that I thought was interesting is if you recombine junk with junk. And what I mean by that is, organizations and parts that have low quality patents, meaning that they're not very influential. If you put those together, you're not going to create something that's very novel. But if you recombine parts of the organization that have influential patents, then you actually result in more innovations that are also of high quality. And here quality means having impact or influence. So other patents in the future are citing these patents. So it's important to know what kinds of recombination are going to be effective. And not all recombination is effective.
So this idea of knowledge recombination is actually quite central in terms of how a firm can innovate successfully. Now, you use this idea of knowledge recombination to focus on the petrochemical industry. And if I recall correctly, petrochemical industries were affected by fracking. And so they decided, the examples that you studied, they decided to take some of their scientists and reassign them. And by doing so, you were also changing the organization. And some of these scientists were brokers in the sense that they were fairly senior and knowledgeable and could help more specialist scientists and technicians and engineers work together from disparate fields. So do you want to talk a little bit about how that study relates to and gives more illumination to this concept of knowledge recombination?
Yeah, it was exciting because the prior study that I talked about was still at 40,000 feet, looking at business units being recombined and kind of assuming that the people are moving and their knowledge is being recombined. In this study of the petrochemical industry, what we wanted to look at is how do organizations make the choices of who to redeploy when there's a new opportunity. And when fracking technology took off in the US, it was a time when the petrochemical firms had to think of redeploying their human resources, meaning their employees, that they wanted to be in these units that were working on this technology and really the creation of ethylene. And so we studied what were the scientists that were moved? Who were the scientists? What were their backgrounds? So were firms moving generalists or specialists? So we're looking at the content of their knowledge. And then we're also looking at there's not only an opportunity at where they're potentially moving to, there might be a cost to moving them because the place that they're leaving may miss them and their influence and their knowledge. So we also looked at their roles as brokers. So what we expected is you're not likely to move brokers because they're very valuable where they are. And you're more likely to just move the generalists. And then we looked at, does it result in more innovation, depending on who you move? And so interestingly, if you move the generalists, we found that sure enough, they are more innovative. And so here it seems that generalists are more adaptive to embracing new knowledge and creating that new knowledge when you have a real new technology, such as fracking. And though we thought that moving brokers would actually be unlikely, it turns out that when brokers are moved, they seem to still be very impactful at still being brokers at their new organization. Again, these are new business units within the firm. And so we also find then that firms are more innovative. So brokers are very influential in creating innovation within the firm when you keep them where they are or when you move them to another location.
Despite the cost to the firm that's losing them or the division that's losing them, the organization gains as a whole by doing this. Excellent.
That's right.
Now, you've also written a lot about the power of modularity and about design rules and about how design rules really governs the alignment of the organization with technology in order to promote innovation. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what exactly are design rules and the power of modularity and why it has such important implications for alignment of the organization?
Sure, Ravi. So before we talk about design rules, I think it's important to define what I mean by organization design.
Okay.
And so to me, organization design is how the organization is set up to get its work done. And so more broadly speaking, that means understanding what tasks need to be accomplished to produce the products or services that you want, and then to know what resources are needed to accomplish those tasks. So the idea of design rules comes up when we think about when firms want to get work done, that there are certain interdependencies that exist. So for example, are certain work done in sequence or are they done in parallel? Is the output of one group of tasks the input to another group of tasks? And so these ideas of interdependence kind of define the organization as a whole. And you can look at this both at the task level, you can also look at this at the resource level. And when you find that there's a lot of interdependence between a certain cluster of components, and I say components because they could be, again, at different levels of analysis, those clusters that are highly interdependent are what we think of as modules. And then and these modules have, again, tight interdependence within them, but between them, there's little interaction. So these design rules are really getting at these ideas of what clusters of resources and workflows are highly interdependent and which ones are more kind of disparate and not as dependent on one another. So this kind of plays a role in how things get done at organizations. And so that's kind of the idea of design rules.
Now, you've mentioned interdependencies. And to me, interdependency also means the potential for bottlenecks. And so you could have bottlenecks of various sorts. And bottlenecks in turn would have some implications for reconfiguration of the organization in order to remove or alleviate those bottlenecks and make the organization function more smoothly and advance innovation. You want to talk about bottlenecks?
Sure. So I think bottlenecks get a bad rap. And I'll tell you why. That usually the term itself seems to imply something negative. But I want to highlight that bottlenecks can both be negative and positive. So the positive idea of bottlenecks is when we think of things being centralized or aggregating at some point before continuing. So think of a workflow where you have certain, let's say, tasks that need to get completed and checked before it will continue, let's say in a production line. In that sense, there is a bottleneck, but that might be good for things like quality assurance, right? And
That's right.
so on the other side, though, we also can think of bottlenecks as holdup. And so a certain number of tasks need to get accomplished or finished because the output of that task may be needed before the next task can happen. And so that's the idea of a negative bottleneck where you have holdup. And so when we think of bottlenecks, I think it's important, one, to make this distinction. When do you want this aggregation to occur before the workflow continues? Versus when do you actually want not to have holdup and you want to have more efficiency in the organization? And perhaps you want to design more things in parallel to mitigate the negative bottlenecks. The second part of this that's interesting is that bottlenecks often occur because you don't have the resources that you need to accomplish the work that you need to get done. And so you can't think of just the tasks, you need to think of the resources that are used for the tasks. And one of the interesting things that we've studied in the past are these two characteristics of resources. One being slack resources. You want to have some extra or excess available, and that's usually good for firms. And you also want resources that are fungible, meaning they can be applied to different uses. However, what I think has been ignored is the idea that you really need both together, or you can't accomplish what you need to. So if we have a fungible resource, but it's already spoken for and being used, then there's no slack. I can't use it to get done what I need to. And similarly, if I have a slack resource that's available, but it's not fungible and I can't apply it to the application I need, it too is not useful to the firm. So this idea of resource bottlenecks is when you do not have both fungibility and slack, and those are necessary to reduce the resource bottlenecks in firms.
Well, I'm thinking in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of talk about Boeing and the difficulties they've had with quality in manufacturing. And it sounds like some of your thoughts about bottlenecks could be not just theoretically thought about, but actually applied in the context of how should Boeing restructure its manufacturing activities to deliberately introduce bottlenecks in some cases so that the quality can be improved by slowing down the pace of the manufacturing. So there's some really important currently practical implications of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned airlines. So though we don't look at the production system, this research that we've been doing on bottlenecks does look at the overall airline industry, looking at their passenger flights. And so looking at how they design the actual routes that they do. And again, the sequencing of what is done in parallel, what is not, how they actually attribute resources, such as their different planes, to different activities that they're doing. All of these things can affect, again, how effective and efficient the airlines are.
Right. Now, one of the other kinds of bottlenecks that we all face, I think, in whichever organization we work, is shortage of human capital, skilled resources, skilled people, right? So you've written about acquisitions where the endpoint of the acquisition is getting good people, hiring, but hiring through acquisitions of scarce talent. And again, I'm thinking of AI and how AI talent is very in great shortage these days, and how companies are desperately trying to find AI leadership and AI talent. So how does your research on acquisition and acqui-hires, as I think you call them, how does this inform innovation when there are bottlenecks for scarce skilled resources, human resources?
Especially right now, Ravi, with the importance of AI, there's a lot of acqui-hires going on. And so sometimes you may hear of it referred to as talent acquisitions, acqui-hires. What this refers to is when firms really are acquiring another firm for its people and for their knowledge and skills. So traditional acquisitions have products usually that are also coming with the acquisition. In acqui-hires, the parent that's acquiring does not keep the actual product or service that they are getting. They're keeping the people, or they're trying to keep the people. And so what we look at for acqui-hires that's really important is, what do we do with these people once we actually acquire? So do we preserve them together in a unit, or do we disperse them in our new organization? And so this could have interesting ramifications to not only what the firm, the acquirer, how innovative they are in accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish, but it also can have a ramification on whether the people stay or not. And so what we find in our study is that when you're acquiring something that's very disruptive potentially to what you do and a potential threat in the market, that we find that most organizations keep their acqui-hired talent preserved and together in a unit. And that's also more likely to keep the founder. So we're not able to look at each employee, but we are able to look at the founders. And so again, usually founders want to work with the group that they initially created. And so if you want to hold on to that key talent of the founders, you probably want to keep this acqui-hire group preserved. Now, interestingly, when you're actually acqui-hiring something that is more complementary to what you already do, and you're just trying to do what you do better, then we think of that as not disruptive. Then we see that firms often actually disperse these employees that they just acquired throughout the organization. And there it doesn't seem as relevant to whether or not it'll actually affect the founder staying or not. What does also affect the founder staying, though, is the status of the position you give the founder when you acqui-hire. And so again, usually these are entrepreneurs. They've been leading organizations. They want to know that they're heard and that they have some impact in the newly acquired parent firm. And so these issues of actually knowing how to integrate your acqui-hired human capital, and including the founder, really have ramifications for whether you as the parent firm, who probably paid a high premium to get this acqui-hire, right? Whether you'll be actually able to keep the people and be more innovative because of that.
I'm reminded some years ago, Google acquired DeepMind, one of the top AI think tanks, if you will, in the world. I think that was based in London or in Cambridge. I can't remember exactly where. And I think one of the central questions was keeping DeepMind together, and rather than trying to bring them over to Silicon Valley. And I think your point about the importance of maintaining that cohesion and therefore the motivation to stay after the hire is maybe manifest in that decision. But since we're talking about global in a sense, an acquisition that took place between the US and England, what are the broad, how should I put it? Does your research apply primarily to the US, or are there lessons about organizational restructuring, alignment, knowledge recombination, the role of design rules and acqui-hires, scientists as brokers when you're trying to stimulate innovation, all these different insights that you've been giving us, are they relevant across borders in, say, China or in the European Union or in Japan, etc.?
Absolutely. But I'll tell you also where I think they might differ. So again, when we think of these issues of org design, reconfiguration, design rules, I'm going to go back to this idea of interdependence. And so we can think of interdependence as being both external and internal. So when we look at internal, those are the ideas that I mentioned of what are your task flows, what are the kind of work that you need to get done? What are the resources you need for that work? That is an idea that really is pervasive across boundaries. So across all sorts of organizations, different countries, work is work. Getting things done, that's, international. The part that might be a little different, though, is when we look at external interdependencies. And so when we think of interdependencies externally, I often think of alliances or how organizations work with other organizations, so partnering. And so we may think that there might be differences in things like chaebols in Korea or keiretsus in Japan, where you have more interlocking boards and different types of interdependencies between organizations that may influence how they partner. But there, some of the findings may be different. But in general, when we look at external interdependencies of alliance partnerships, for example, then I would say that the studies that I've done and the findings are, again, very much applicable to all parts of the world.
So you've given us a lot of very interesting insights. If I'm a manager, and there are many managers who listen to this podcast, what are some of the lessons they can take away that they can start thinking about from their viewpoint of, I want to make my firm more innovative, I want to promote better productivity, I want to increase our competitive positioning and likelihood of competitive advantage? Those are all very common preoccupations of high-level managers. So what are some of the lessons you would ask them to take away from this brief talk we're having?
So I think what's really important is knowing how you design your organization and why it's designed the way it is. So to me, organization design is very proactive. I hope you notice I don't use the term organization structure. And the reason is structure seems very kind of
Rigid.
rigid, unchanging.
Yes.
Design is to design is a verb, right? We don't say to structure very often. And so I think for managers, it's important to think about what work they're trying to get done and how is the best way to design their organization to get that work done. And so that's part one, is to really know the flow of activities within the organization, who is dependent on who, what the outflows of what part of the organization are inflows to others, what resources are needed. And this gets at the second thing that I think is very important and proactive for firms to do, which is to be reconfiguring. And reconfiguring, very often we think of just acquisitions. That's something that gets a lot of press and a lot of time is spent around acquisitions. But as important as acquisitions actually is divestiture, because there's an opportunity cost to everything that the firm holds and maintains, right? And so thinking about what should we actually get rid of so that it actually frees us up to do other things is as important in this idea of reconfiguration. And building on this idea of reconfiguration, I think managers really need to think thoughtfully about how are we going to recombine or redeploy our resources. So when we think of physical resources, we often think of this idea of redeployment. And when we think of knowledge recombination, though, we're thinking of people, right? Here we have a very tangible resource where the people keep the knowledge. And so we want to think of what creates the most value for how we use our resources. Do we want to recombine knowledge? Does that mean moving people around? And even for other types of resources, where may they be giving us more value than maybe residing where they currently are? So all of these ideas of org design and reconfiguration are things that managers should be doing proactively all the time.
Samina, thank you so much for your deeply insightful interview. You've given our audience a great deal to think about. And you, our audience, thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to our International Business Today podcast series. We have released around 30 episodes, and we're constantly recording and releasing new episodes on a regular basis. And of course, we would be more than happy to receive your comments and suggestions for future episodes. We're always trying to make this a better and more useful series for all of you. This is Professor Ravi Sarathi in the International Business and Strategy Group at the mckim School of Business at Northeastern University. My guest has been Professor Samina Karim of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Group, also at DMSB at Northeastern. Thank you for listening, and see you again soon on another podcast.